What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today's going to be another video working on the 80 series Landcruiser. In this video we're going to dive in and show you everything that's needed to replace the axle seal, that outer gasket, wheel bearings themselves as far as repacking with grease and cleaning them up, proper torque specs, how to preload the axle nut and everything on the bearing itself. So let's get right to it. As far as parts go to get the job done, I actually went on eBay, got most of this stuff. So this is our inner axle seal. This is what keeps diff fluid from getting in our wheel bearings. This is going to be the seal that goes on the back of the hub. This is a very similar setup to like a trailer wheel bearing, almost identical. And if you guys have watched my timbering videos where I assemble the axle and suspension, we got our inner and outer bearings. These are rear seals that I got from Cruiser Outfitters. They got a bunch of OEM stuff on their website, which is super awesome. So it was easy to find that. Went ahead and ordered that from them. It was cheap, like, you know, maybe $6 for the gaskets. This will be for the nut in the back, and this is how we're going to preload our bearings, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the video. All right, so the first thing you want to do is remove your rotor and caliper. I obviously have this caliper hanging here because I was doing some other work with brake lines. Once you get it to this point, this should spin nice and freely. The next part we're going to have to take off. So there's a nut, a lock washer, and then there's kind of like a cone washer that's in there that helps lock this all in place. I've already broken all these loose. This being said, on the other side, some of them were stuck, and even with some heat, two of the studs broke. So hopefully all these come out. I'm going to check them all, make sure they come out so I can order some new ones if need be. So first thing we're going to do is run these nuts out, and you want to get them to where they're just flush with the edge, because we're going to have to tap on these with a hammer to help free up these cone washers. All right, so as you see, I have this nut back to where it's flush with this stud here. If they've been off recently, the cone washers will probably come out pretty easy. You can see this is the lock washer moving around. The cone washer is actually seated in the flange for our axle here. First thing we want to do is give it some tap. They say to use a brass hammer, but the nut is going to help protect our stud. If you're going to not be replacing your wheel bearings, I don't recommend hitting here because it's going to put load on them. I will be replacing the wheel bearings, so I'm not too worried about it. So I'm also going to give it some taps all around here. There we go. Alrighty, so I don't know if you guys can see that. See, now the cone washer came free and it's spinning around, so we can run our nut off. And now you can remove your lock washer as well as your cone washer here. The reason they get stuck is, first off, this is kind of like a spring-loaded assembly. You can see the gap, and also some rust can form on the inside around the stud. That is what can cause them to get stuck and give you some issues. If you do end up getting some that are being a little tough, take a torch, heat them up. That's what I had to do to the other side. Most of the time, they seemed like they would come free after some tapping and a little bit of patience, some penetrating oil of some sort. So now we're just gonna run around. We're gonna repeat what we just did for this one for the rest of our nuts and our stud, and then we'll be ready to remove our axle.
As you can see, almost every single stud I had to use the torch on. Just take your time, don't get carried away with the hammer and end up bending the stud, because this is just gonna make it hard to get your washer and your cone washer off the stud after you get it free.
All right, you can see some of the studs actually pulled out, and I also noticed from the hammering, some of the studs actually got tweaked. They seemed like they were kind of weak. I don't know if they've been over tightened in the past. What I'm gonna do is actually just replace all of these stud and cone washers and lock washers and everything on both sides, just so I know that ARP makes a kit. I don't know if I'll go that route. Anyways, I will be replacing all those. So next, you're gonna wanna pull your free float axle out of the axle itself. So if you notice, there's some unused threaded holes on the hub. There's one on each side, here and here. And if you use an 8x125 thread bolt, in this case I'm using a thread chaser just because, you know, there's already junk in there and it's kind of a 2-for-1 thing. So you can go ahead and put your thread chaser in there, and then as you tighten this up, it'll protrude through the flange and press against the hub itself. And you can see mine's already started to separate, and you can watch this gap right here get bigger as you go. It's helping you pull the axle out of the differential and also break this sealing surface here, because if you stick screwdrivers in there and try to pry and stuff like that, you can damage your surfaces and it'll have trouble sealing later on after you put it back together. All right, after using our bolts to pull our flange out, now you can see the whole axle wants to come out of here. Part of the reason they get stuck, see there's some dowel pins on here that actually guide your flange. They can get stuck on there, and that's also what kind of makes it hard to get off. From this point, you can completely remove the axle from the housing itself, and we're gonna go put this somewhere safe where it's not gonna get dirty and, you know, junk and all that stuff falling all over. All right, now that we've come this far, I just took some brake clean and cleaned this up. If you're only replacing your axle seal and let's say the axle seal is leaking, you've serviced your wheel bearings in the past, you do not have to do this next part. This is your axle seal right here. So you could simply just kind of pop this out just like that and then end up putting in your new one. But since we are doing the wheel bearings, we'll go a step further than that. This outer collar here is what sets our preload on the wheel bearings themselves. First off, there's some Phillips set screws. There's 2 of them. They can be a little stuck if somebody really cranked them in there in the past. Sometimes a good screwdriver will do the trick. Other times you may need an impact driver. Basically one of those things that looks like a big punch that you hit with a hammer and it forces it to turn it. I got the other side loose with just a screwdriver, so we're going to go ahead and see if we can get this side loose. Here we go, that one broke loose. And just be really cautious when you're doing this, because if you end up stripping that Phillips screw, you're gonna have a heck of a time trying to get it out of there and extract it. So really take your time with this and make sure you're not gonna end up stripping that. So now that we've backed them off, you should be able to take a screwdriver and you can see this thing is just starting to just turn right off. So just pick a hole, go ahead and wheel it off. I do recommend having a bucket of some sort below your axle just to catch parts if they fall. If you're working in grass or gravel, it could be really easy to lose a small important part. So the first piece off, we're gonna go ahead and set it in our tote down here. So now our hub is completely free. As you can see, we're moving it back and forth. You're gonna have this first collar that's gonna come off. See if we can get it out. There we go. And then next, our outer bearing is gonna come along with our whole hub. Next, what I'm gonna do is go ahead and set this hub in here. And while we're outside where it's dirty, we're not reusing these bearings, so I'm not gonna damage them. But this is obviously gonna be our outer bearing. I'm gonna set it on the right side here, and then our inner bearing we'll be able to pull out once we get into the garage. I'm gonna take some brake clean. It's because there's plenty of diff oil in this thing because of our leaking axle seal. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean it out. And of course, cleaning this thing out is just gonna make it a little more enjoyable to work on once we get it inside. All right, we got the hubs here in the garage. As you can see, I've already pulled this one out. So basically what I did, I took a wire wheel and went in and cleaned this up a little bit. And then we're gonna end up using a hammer and a screwdriver. First, I'm gonna try to pluck it out just by using a screwdriver like this. Sometimes you can. As you can see, these things are like the original seals. They've been in there a long time. There's lots of rust. So what I'll end up doing, while being cautious about this edge of our sealing surface on the inside, is take our screwdriver and hammer and run some punches down this way, just so I can get a gap, so I can get a screwdriver in there and kind of pry it and work this thing out. So first we're gonna attempt to do this in a more civilized manner. Basically get your screwdriver in here. As you can see, this thing does not want to budge. I'm gonna take our screwdriver and we're gonna end up doing some punches through here. Take note of the direction of the screwdriver. We're staying away from this hub surface, and also be mindful of your ABS sensor teeth. You don't want to mess those up. And put this thing back together and end up with some ABS codes. There you go. So then just like that, the seal just disappears somewhere behind their bikes. With our seal out of the way, we now have full access to our inner wheel bearing. So you can see this kind of pulls right out. Zero grease left in this thing. It's been running in diff oil. Diff oil does lubricate, but these things are meant to run in grease. So that's another reason why I'm replacing them, because I just knew that this was going to be the case when I pulled it apart. Next, you just want to clean everything up. There's actually a replaceable race right here, the bearing race. So I'm going to clean them up, inspect them real good, make sure they don't look like they have any scoring or marks or anything like that. And if they seem nice and smooth, I'm not going to worry about putting in new races. I'm sure I'll be in the rear end of this thing again sometime in the future if I did want to replace them. All right, before we go cleaning up the inside of these cavities in preparation for new bearings and grease and everything like that, since there's going to be some junk flying around when we clean these surfaces, we're going to go ahead and take our wire brush on the drill and we're going to go ahead and clean these up. If you see any debris or feel anything, you're going to want to clean that up. So when we do clean, there's not going to be a chance of any bits and shavings and stuff like that getting in our cavities and then eventually ending up in our wheel bearings. Next up, we got our little bucket out here again. We're gonna take some brake clean and we're gonna clean up all traces of diff fluid in here and get this thing completely dry and no moisture in there, in preparation for greasing our bearings and loading this thing up with grease and reassembly. Alrighty, we got all of our old studs removed. I wanted to make sure they were gonna come out before I assembled these hubs and put them on the truck. All I did was take a little bit of propane torch, and then these are Parrot nose vice grip pliers. I will link them in the description, just like everything else. These things are awesome. As you can see, it's the most contact you can get on a stud shaped item. We'll go ahead and flip these over because we're going to be doing our rear bearings first because we have to put our seal on top of that. At work we use one of these and ended up buying one for myself for the house just because it's awesome. You set your bearing in there. When you put this on top of it and start applying force, grease will force its way up through those cones and just totally fill all the chambers on the bearings, and it just makes it super easy to make sure they're nice and properly greased. Of course, you can do the method where you put grease on your hand and just kind of hand pack them. Either way works, but I'm just going to go ahead and do this method. As you can see, we've started to apply pressure and the grease is already creeping up here through these rollers, so these things just work great. Go ahead and do these to both of our inside bearings. With our bearings all packed with grease, one thing you want to do is line the inside of our hub with a nice thick layer of grease. You obviously don't want to fill the entire cavity, but I mean, you can see this one isn't greased quite yet, and you can see how deep that inside wall is, and then you can see how much grease I have in there. And also just put a layer of grease on the race that the bearing's going to be riding on. Once you do that, then you can go ahead and grab your bearing, slide it down in there, and then I'm going to go ahead and do the other side, and then we can prep for seal install. Alrighty, so here we got our seal. They only go in one way. The side that goes in is going to be the side with that raised edge. Just go ahead and kind of get it nice and centered. You want to use something like a piece of wood like this that's nice and soft. Make sure it's dust free so it's not knocking some junk down in there. But something just about the width of the seal, and if you just kind of hit it in the center, you can get it started. Make sure that all of your edges are nice and even as you're going in. You do not want this thing going in crooked, or it's going to end up not sealing how it's supposed to. Another reason I like using a piece of wood like this is, as you can see, you cannot push the seal in too far, as it's going to hit our edges here, and make sure that it's nice and flush with our outer surface. Next thing you want to do, you'll notice that there's kind of like a cup on the inside edge of this seal. You do not want to put that on there dry. You're going to want to take a little bit of grease and just kind of fill that cup up, because if you run a dry seal on dry metal, it's just going to cook it and it'll end up wearing out, and then you'll be wondering why your new seals aren't sealing. So go ahead and fill this in with grease, and then after that we'll go ahead and pack our front bearings, and then we'll take these hubs back out to the truck, get them on our spindle, and then we'll start assembling. All right, before we can put our hub on, this sealing surface right here, that seal that we just installed is going to ride right here. So just make sure that's super clean. I had some mud all packed up in here that I had to clean out. Any debris you leave on there is going to end up in your wheel bearings, so you'll end up with an early failure if that happens. Go ahead and be mindful of your seal. Slide this on. Now is a great time also to clean and adjust your parking brake if you need to. Went ahead and staged our outer bearing that we pre-greased. I'm actually just going to put a bit more grease in there. That grease will help keep any dirt and mud and grime out of your bearing, so it is an important protection layer here inside your hub. Now we're going to use this collar. So there's also a locator. In this locator, you'll see it on the top of your snout. Go ahead and put that in. We got this all cleaned up. Make sure your screws are backed off so you can screw it on. There we go. And then just go ahead and run it in with your hands. Before we do our set screws, next up we're going to be using that special socket I talked about earlier. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and stick our special tool in there. We got our torque wrench set to 43 foot-pounds. We're going to do an initial torque down. All right, that's 43. And then they want you to go ahead and roll this thing around. And what that's doing is just letting the bearings seat and get where they're supposed to be. And we'll just go ahead and roll it around. We'll just say 10 times. Just to be thorough. All right, now that we've rolled it around, they want you to go ahead and torque it to 43 foot-pounds once again. This is per all data. This is what all data tells you to do if you look up this procedure. See, you can see that we got a little bit more out of it that time. Next, they want you to go ahead and back it off a little bit. So we're gonna back it off, and you can see it's starting to move nice and free. We're checking for end play here. We do not want it to be able to move around. Spec is actually, they use like a drag meter that hooks onto a lug nut, and you pull it, and it's supposed to have, I believe it's like 12.8 foot-pounds of drag on this. If you've ever done any trailer bearings or anything like that in the past, you know you don't want it tight. It's tight, it's gonna create friction, and friction creates heat, and heat is what will kill a wheel bearing. So you can see that's nice and free, and I think that's looking pretty good. I don't feel any play at all. So after that, we're gonna basically, there's only a couple spots that these little screws will line up with. If you remember the holes on that other spacer we put, if you line that up, they give you a few options. You can kind of move around and see what fits best. Just make sure that when you do these lock screws into those holes that are on the inside, that this thing is properly tensioned. Once you get your holes lined up, you'll know they're lined up because the screw can actually go all the way down until it seats. If you cannot get it to seat with this nut, then you are not lined up at the holes. So they say 48 inch-pounds. Obviously that's not very tight, so I'm just going to kind of snug these with my hand. I don't have an inch-pound torque wrench on me at the moment. And then we'll get into installing our axle seal. So we got our new axle seal here. Taking our paper towel, we've wiped this all out. I know that looks discolored, but that's just discolored metal. That's not junk or anything. This only goes in one way. You can see that tension spring, that's going to go on the inside. As the axle goes in, you don't want it going against the lip. You want it to kind of flow with it. A little bit of grease on the outside of this thing just to help it go in. You should be able to push this in with your thumb for the most part, and then it should be flush with this outer edge. All right, because I'm waiting on these studs to come in, we are not going to install the axle quite yet. I'm going to go ahead and shove a paper towel in right here to keep some junk out. I'm going to get a grocery bag and put it over this thing just to protect this from the elements. I'll go ahead and assemble the other side, and I'll see you guys back when I get the studs. While we're waiting for our studs to come in so we can reinstall our axles, went ahead and cleaned up this flange just like we did the face of the hub. Used the wire wheel on the Milwaukee drill, and then also some razor blades to get some of the tough stuff off. And you can see now it's a nice clean surface. One other thing to watch for, you remember we were hammering on this surface just a little bit. Just make sure you don't have any bulges coming through. If this sealing surface is bulged a little bit on the lip, it's going to interfere with how it seals. So just spin them both around, make sure they look good. Mine look good. I think they make them out of some pretty tough stuff, so no worries there, just as long as you weren't wailing on it. Another good thing to inspect while these are out is make sure none of your splines look like they're twisted. If there's any sort of twist, if these aren't perfectly straight from end to end, then you can expect a breakage in the near future. Mainly if you're running some big tires, you'll run into that. This thing was on 33s for pretty much its entire life, I assume. So 33s don't have a whole lot of leverage, and these stock axles held up pretty great. I do not see any twisting at all on my splines. So these axles, once I brake clean these splines off and everything like that, these will be good to go when our stud kit comes in. All right guys, our order came in from Cruiser Outfitters, and I got these seals for these axle flanges and also new stud kits for both sides, and I got them for the front as well. They come with the new cone washers, the lock washers, the studs. They sell them in 6-packs, so you can get 4 packs and cover the whole Cruiser. So we'll go ahead, and now that we got our gasket sitting on here, you can just kind of align your holes, and these pins will kind of help hold it on. I have seen some people put some RTV and stuff like that on here. I'm not going to. I'm going to have to come back in this thing anyway, so maybe I'll be able to save this gasket when I pull the axles out for the re-gear. We'll just kind of have to see, and we'll see if it leaks or not. Should be good with the paper gasket because all of my surfaces here are still in great shape. So we'll go ahead and get these studs installed on both sides, and then we'll get to putting these axles back in.
Something to note here is the studs have a short and a long side, and the long side is what is going to be going into our hub.
With all of our studs installed, I put a little bit of grease on our new axle seal right here, just because you don't want any dry seals, especially stuff that's going to be, you know, rotating. Make sure the sealing surface that this seals against on your axle shaft is clean as well. Put a little bit of Never Seize on these dowel pins here, just to kind of help them come off in the future. I did put a little Never Seize on the threads for these studs going in the hub. Not a ton of it. So yeah, with our gasket in place, we're ready to go ahead and put our axle shaft in. On the driver's side, it's going to be your longest one. It's furthest away from the pumpkin. I am going to put just a little bit of grease on the end right here, and that's just going to help it seat into the differential. You may have to spin the hub a little bit until the splines line up for it to actually, you know, kind of lock into the differential itself. Any other resistance you may be feeling, maybe these dowel pins going into the flange as well. So we'll go ahead and support the front of the shaft on the way in. Be careful of your axle seal. Okay, now we're looking for how these are going to line up. So you can see here, this is a dowel pin hole, so that's going to line up with there, and then obviously these are going to line up with our studs. All right, there we go. You can see it finally made it past and went into the differential itself, and then so now it's nice and smooth. You can see it's starting to press on those dowel pins, and it gets a little bit tight. It's going to be totally normal. You can either take a rubber mallet and kind of tap it in, or we can kind of use our nuts and our cone washers and everything to help drive it in. I'm probably going to get a hammer and just lightly tap this in. Next up is going to be installing our cone washer, our lock washer, and then our nut. Cone washer goes first. I am going to put just a tad of Never Seize on these things just because I want them to come out nice and easy in the future. It shouldn't affect how it's the torque or anything like that. It should be perfectly fine. I'm just kind of looking out for myself in the future here if I ever have to come back into this axle and do any work. All right, so I went ahead and torqued these studs. There's some conflicting information online. Some people say 25 foot-pounds. I went ahead and went to 20, and then I went to 22. and I think 25 would be a little much. Some people even said that it would end up stripping the stud at 25, so 22 should hold it just perfectly fine with our lock washers and everything. And so with our axles in both sides and everything all torqued, I kind of dove into the parking brake a little bit. I didn't put it on video just because it was kind of a dirty, nasty mess. Basically, there's 6 points of contact, bottom and top and sides, 3 on each shoe. I went ahead and took a screwdriver and kind of peeled those back and put some moly lube, pulled off the star adjusters on the bottom, and they were just completely seized up. So I got those unstuck, went ahead and cleaned those up and lubed them up and put them back in. Got our rotor here, adjusted the parking brake to where it's not dragging, but it's, you know, it's right there, so whenever I operate the handbrake, it should have a nice bite on the rotor, and the parking brake on this thing should actually end up working pretty good. The shoes didn't look too bad. I may have to do them in the future, but for now I'm just going to run them how they are. We'll go ahead and get the rest of the rear brakes assembled, and then I think that will about wrap up this video. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys are enjoying this build. I know some of this stuff can be a little meticulous and maybe even boring if you're not diving into this project yourself. I'm trying to make it as informative and interesting as possible, so please bear with me. I will have some other projects resembling like the micro camper, not necessarily another trailer, but I have more stuff like that coming in the future for the channel. For now, I'm just working on this 80 series and really excited to get it on the road. So don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.